In 1938, the SEC discovered that one of America's largest drug distributors had been fabricating inventory worth millions, and nobody saw it coming. The conventional story is straightforward. A criminal named Donald Miller invented fake pharmaceutical stock. Auditors missed it because they were careless, and the scandal forced the SEC to tighten accounting rules. That's what the textbooks teach. But that version collapses the moment you look at what auditors were actually required to do in 1938 and what they weren't. McKesson Robbins was founded in 1903 and became the largest drug distributor in America by the 1930s. By 1938, it was generating roughly $67 million in annual revenue in Depression dollars. That's equivalent to over $3 billion today. The company seemed bulletproof. It paid dividends reliably. Its stock traded on the New York Stock Exchange. Thousands of investors owned shares, confident they'd made a sound choice. In December 1938, a routine internal audit uncovered something impossible. Inventory records didn't match physical stock. Not by a small margin, not by a percentage point or two, by roughly $7 million, about 10% of the company's reported assets. And most of that discrepancy traced back to one person, a senior executive named Donald Miller, who controlled purchasing and inventory. Miller had been creating phantom inventory entries since the early 1930s. He'd record shipments of drugs that never arrived, create fake supplier invoices, and book the revenue. The money didn't vanish, he wasn't stealing it outright. Instead, he was using the phantom inventory to manipulate the company's balance sheet, inflate profits, and keep the stock price elevated. For nearly a decade, he'd done this with virtually no detection. When the company's internal auditors finally caught him, they immediately contacted the SEC. Within weeks, federal investigators moved in. Miller was arrested, charged with fraud, and the scandal exploded across front pages. The immediate conclusion was obvious. The external auditors, the firm Waterhouse, had failed catastrophically. How could they have missed $7 million in fake inventory? The answer seemed simple: negligence. But here's where the conventional story breaks. Waterhouse wasn't actually permitted to physically inspect inventory. This wasn't a secret, it wasn't hidden in fine print, it was standard auditing practice in 1938. Auditors relied on management assertions and internal controls. They didn't have the authority or the contractual right to open crates, count pills, or verify that shipments actually existed. That was management's job. The real story is about incentive structures that nobody had bothered to examine. Miller had motive. He owned stock and stood to profit from a rising share price. He had opportunity. He controlled the very records auditors relied on. And he had cover. The system trusted him because nobody had designed a system that didn't have to. The auditors weren't corrupt. They were working within a framework that assumed managers wouldn't systematically lie about their own company's assets. Investors lost real money. The stock price collapsed. Shareholders who'd believed Waterhouse's audit opinion discovered that their investment had been built on phantom inventory. The damage wasn't theoretical, it was quantifiable. Thousands of people's retirement savings, widow's nest eggs, small business owners' reserves. All of it vaporized because one man decided to commit fraud and nobody had built a system to stop him. The SEC's response was decisive. They didn't just fine the company, they fundamentally rewrote auditing requirements. Beginning in 1939, auditors were required to physically observe inventory counts. They were mandated to confirm receivables directly with customers. They had to verify bank balances independently. These weren't suggestions. They became non-negotiable audit procedures. But the deeper shift was philosophical. The McKesson Robbins scandal forced regulators to admit that trusting management's word wasn't enough. The system had been designed on an assumption that turned out to be naive, that large, public companies wouldn't systematically deceive their own auditors. Miller proved that assumption wrong, and once it was wrong, the entire framework had to change. Waterhouse's reputation survived, though damaged. The firm had been following the rules as they existed. Once the rules changed, they adapted. But the scandal left a permanent mark on American finance, the principle that audits exist not because management is assumed to be dishonest, but because the stakes are too high to assume anything. Verification became mandatory, trust became secondary. The McKesson Robbins case teaches a lesson that echoes through every financial scandal since. Systems don't fail because people are evil. They fail because nobody anticipated how they'd be exploited. Miller wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was an executive with access to the books and the realization that the audit process gave him room to operate. Once he saw the gap, he stepped through it. What changed wasn't auditor competence, it was auditor mandate. The SEC didn't assume auditors were smarter after 1939. It assumed they couldn't be trusted to rely on anyone else's word. Every major accounting scandal since from Enron to WorldCom to the Ranos has reinforced that lesson. The system works only when verification is independent, mandatory, and structural, not when it depends on hope. By 1940, auditing had been permanently transformed. The McKesson Robbins scandal cost thousands of investors millions of dollars in real losses. But it bought something invaluable, a regulatory framework that assumed fraud was possible and built safeguards to prevent it. That's not a small thing. It's the foundation that made public capital markets trustworthy enough to exist. The scandal also revealed something uncomfortable about human nature. Donald Miller wasn't unique, he was just the first one caught in a system that hadn't been designed to catch him. How many others were doing the same thing at other companies? How many got away with it? The SEC never found out, but the question itself became the justification for every auditing rule that followed. 85 years later, auditing standards are vastly more complex than they were in 1938. But the principle remains unchanged. Verification must be independent. Auditors can't rely on management's word. They must see, confirm, and document. That principle came directly from the moment an auditor realized that $7 million in inventory didn't actually exist, and nobody had been checking. The McKesson and Robbins scandal was expensive. Investors lost money, companies faced new compliance costs, auditors had to do more work, but those costs bought something that markets absolutely require to function: the reasonable belief that published financial statements aren't elaborate fiction. Without that belief, capital markets collapse. With it, billions of dollars can flow from savers to entrepreneurs with confidence that the numbers mean something real. Subscribe so you don't miss the next corporate collapse that reshaped how Wall Street works.